when gamification works and when it doesn't, what the evidence actually shows. Gamification has a reputation. Add badges, add points, add leaderboards, motivation rises, scores improve, participation explodes. That's the promise. But education is rarely that simple. If motivation could be engineered with a progress bar, we would have solved disengagement decades ago. So the real question is not whether gamification sounds motivating. The real question is this: when we gather all the controlled evidence together, what actually happens? Welcome. Today we're going to think carefully about gamification, not as a trend, not as a buzzword, but as a body of research. Let's start by clarifying the problem the researchers wanted to solve. Gamification is often defined as the use of game-like elements, badges, points, levels, leaderboards, in non-game contexts. In this case, education. The underlying assumption is rooted in motivation theory, particularly self-determination theory, which proposes that people are driven by needs for competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Badges may signal competence. Leaderboards create social comparison and relatedness. Points and levels suggest progress and mastery. The theory makes sense, but theory is not evidence. So the researchers asked, does gamification actually produce measurable changes in student behavior and performance? And if it does, under what conditions? Instead of looking at one study, they conducted a meta-analysis. That means they systematically gathered experimental studies, extracted statistical data, and calculated overall effect sizes to see what the broader pattern reveals. They followed PRISMA guidelines to identify relevant studies. From 253 initial records, after removing duplicates and excluding studies that did not meet strict criteria, such as lacking a control group or focusing on full games rather than gamification elements, they ended up with 18 experimental studies suitable for quantitative synthesis. These 18 studies generated 32 effect sizes. This matters. A meta-analysis does not tell us whether gamification works in one classroom. It estimates the average effect across multiple controlled contexts. The unit of analysis becomes effect size, specifically Cohen's d, which tells us how much the treatment group differs from the control group in standardized terms. Using a random effects model, they found an overall effect size of 0.48, with a 95% confidence interval from 0.33 to 0.62. In practical terms, that is a moderate positive effect. Gamification, on average, appears to increase behavioral outcomes, such as participation and test performance, compared to non-gamified conditions. But here is where the story becomes more complex. An average effect hides variation. The researchers examined moderators, variables that might influence the strength of gamification's impact. They looked at age group, intervention length, and type of outcome measure. The age findings are particularly intriguing. For K-12 students, the effect size was 0.92. For adults, it was 0.95. For college students, however, the effect size dropped dramatically to 0.15, with a confidence interval that crossed zero. This suggests that gamification was strongly effective for school-age learners and adults, but far less impactful for college students. Why might that be? The article discusses developmental and contextual factors. Older adults may respond strongly to visible progress indicators and social comparison mechanisms. Younger students may find gamified elements novel and motivating. College students, however, occupy a transitional developmental space. Perhaps gamification is less novel. Perhaps intrinsic motivations shift. Perhaps social comparison mechanisms function differently. The study does not definitively answer why. It shows the pattern, and this is a crucial distinction in critical reading. Evidence identifies relationships. Interpretation explains them. Then there is intervention length. Short interventions, less than 1 hour, produced a remarkably large effect size of 1.57. Interventions lasting 2 to 16 weeks produced a moderate effect of 0.39. Interventions lasting 1 to 2 years produced a slightly negative effect size of -0.20. This does not mean gamification becomes harmful over time, but it suggests that its motivational boost may fade or even reverse when extended long-term. The authors connect this pattern to the idea of hyperbolic discounting. People prefer immediate rewards over delayed ones. Short bursts of gamification may capitalize on novelty and immediacy. Long-term exposure may reduce excitement or introduce fatigue. But if you were designing an educational program based solely on headlines that say gamification works, would you anticipate that it might lose impact over time? This is why nuance matters. The researchers also compared outcome types. Participation levels showed a higher effect size, 0.60, than test scores, 0.30. Gamification appears to increase engagement more strongly than it increases measured academic performance. That difference is subtle but important. Increased participation does not automatically translate into deep learning. It may create more time on task, which can support achievement, but it is not equivalent to mastery. And here, the evidence forces us to be cautious. All included studies were quasi-experimental rather than fully randomized controlled trials. That means participants were not randomly assigned in the strictest sense. Educational settings make true randomization difficult. The average methodological quality, measured with the Downs and Black checklist, was classified as fair. Internal validity was moderate. Power reporting was limited. The authors explicitly warned that the moderate overall effect should not be interpreted as establishing causal certainty. In other words, gamification is associated with positive behavioral changes, but the strength and generalizability of those conclusions are bounded by study design limitations. They also assessed publication bias using a funnel plot and Egger's test. Although the funnel plot visually showed more positive than negative effects, statistical testing did not indicate significant publication bias. That reduces, but does not eliminate, the concern that only positive studies were published. So what can we responsibly conclude? Gamification, as implemented through elements like badges and leaderboards, tends to produce moderate improvements in behavioral outcomes. It appears particularly effective in short-term interventions. Its effects vary across age groups. It increases participation more reliably than test performance, and its long-term impact remains uncertain. This information is based on the article Effects of Gamification on Behavioral Change in Education, a meta-analysis, written by Ji-Hoon Kim and Darla M. Castelli, published in 2021 in the journal International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, MDPI, Switzerland. The study systematically reviewed and quantitatively synthesized 18 experimental studies conducted between 2010 and 2019, using a random effects meta-analytic model to estimate overall effect sizes and examine moderators such as age, intervention length, and outcome measurement. Now let us return to the guiding question. Does gamification work? The evidence suggests yes, under certain conditions. But that is not the most important lesson. The deeper lesson is about how evidence is built. A single study can inspire optimism. A meta-analysis forces us to confront variability. Moderator analyses remind us that context matters. Confidence intervals remind us that estimates are ranges, not certainties. And methodological quality reminds us that evidence has limits. Gamification is not magic. It is a motivational tool whose effectiveness depends on who, how long, and for what purpose. If we ignore those conditions, we exaggerate. If we attend to them, we design more intelligently. So perhaps the more interesting question is not whether gamification works, but whether we're willing to read evidence carefully enough to use it responsibly. Because educational innovation is not about adding points and badges. It is about understanding when and why those tools make a difference. If this kind of careful reading matters to you, if you want to learn not just what research says, but how to interpret it, This channel is a space for that kind of thinking. I would genuinely like to know, in your experience, have motivational tools created lasting change, or only short bursts of engagement? I'm the research junkie. I do the research, so you don't have to.